this talk on from marketing data warehouse to actual customer data activation. The start of an exciting journey, at least that's what I hope that you have as a sentiment at the end of the presentation, and I didn't give you a headache by sharing all of the stuff that we messed up along the way trying to get it done. First of all, who am I? I'm Glenn. I am co-founder at Human37. I'm Belgium-based, and I'm pretty to very exciting to be here. I'm also kind of scared shitless because of the big setup that they have here, but that will be fine, I've been told. 10 years ago, when I started in analytics, let's say, Tracken was already a big name, so I'm very happy to be here on stage. Today, my main occupation is I work still kind of in tracking, in customer data platforms, analytics, customer data as a whole, a lot of product analytics as well. And there's a massive disclaimer. I have no technical background whatsoever. I studied business school, and my father is a programmer. I kind of got geeked out by all of that stuff, got my first job in a technical environment, and everything went from there. So everything that I'll be sharing here is based on actual experience. Most of the time we'll be breaking stuff rather than doing best practices, but it kind of sets the scene to where the industry is going, I feel. What's the objective of this talk? I've been told that there would be a lot of people who are on the GMP stack moving into GCP and building their data warehouse or building their applications there. So what we're going to explore today is exploring the different components of an actual customer data warehouse. We're going to zoom in a couple of components, mostly unification, reverse ETL, if you're familiar with that. I'll also give you a quick introduction into customer data platforms as such. It's a non-technical talk. It's based on experience. It also means that there's probably 100 million ways to do it differently. You guys are all smart people, so the objective is for you to get excited to do something with your data, to go home, to take the insights that you've got, and to build stuff on your own, right? First of all, why do we move data to a cloud-based data warehouse? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, right? I want to be the ownership of my data, or I want to have the ownership of my data, kind of what Alejandro kind of alluded to. I want to create better marketing reporting. After this, I believe there's also a talk about custom attribution in GCP. Those are all very valid use cases, right? Some people would like to build their own visualization on top of GA4 data. I hope Brian is not in the room anymore, but those are all valid reasons. And the interesting part is you're not alone. If you look at the growing market of data warehousing as a whole, it's exploding. Everybody's actually trying to figure out, like, okay, how can I put my data together? What are these amazing use cases that I come up with, and do I need a data warehouse infrastructure to get there? Couple of figures, whatever research you kind of look into, growth rates would be between 20 and 25% for data warehousing as a whole in the next couple of years. That being said, from our perspective at least, not all data warehouses are created equal. What does that mean? And it's kind of the allusion that we make in the title of this presentation, from marketing data warehouse to customer data activation. Well, there's two types of warehouses in general. There's marketing data warehouses, and there's customer data warehouses. Obviously, there's a million other types of data warehouses, right? But for this crowd, I believe these are the two most relevant ones. What's the difference? In a marketing data warehouse setup, mostly the sources include advertising channels, sometimes a bit behavioral data. Think of GA4 streams or stuff that gets directly streamed into your data warehouse. There's very little to no PII, and that PII would be anonymous IDs or user IDs or pseudo IDs, that type of stuff. And mostly the objective is to get some reporting done. We take data from a source, we move it into what we call an ETL layer, extract, transform, or load. You could also stream it depending on what your setup looks like. It then moves into a landing zone where you do some transformations. We usually use dbt for that. You materialize the tables, and then you put some data visualization tools to work to get the actual insights reporting, whatever you want, right? If we compare this to a customer data warehouse, there's a bunch of differences. First of all, the sources are going to be based on data points that we capture or that are generated, let's say, by customers of your organization. It means that all the data points we capture are going to be PII loaded. All of the data points or data packages that we ship into the data warehouse, that we're now going to call a customer data warehouse, have an identifier, right? Very interesting, because we're going to see later on, it brings a lot of challenges, unification as such. The objective of a customer data warehouse could be to report on, but the most important piece is to actually do something with the data. Activate your data. Activating a data, what could that mean? Could you quickly do a raise of hands if you're familiar with Facebook CAPI, Conversion API, and if you've been playing with that? It's cool because this also qualifies for my biggest hand raiser ever, so that's a check in the box. That being said, like if you want to get Facebook CAPI data into Facebook, you're going to have transactional data that you need. There's going to be PII involved. Could be one of the use cases that you're interested in. Looking into building negative audiences based on actual transactional data. Most people here would call it like server-side data. We call it transactional data. De facto, it's going to be stored in a warehouse. But having those purchase audiences as negative audiences for your advertising efforts to just make sure that you don't see the advertising of the sneakers when people are already wearing the shoes that they bought, right? Very valid use case for ROI and ad spend. And one of my favorites that we're actually doing with one of our clients is building negative audiences based on people who have open tickets with support. Nobody wants to be the content manager that needs to take care of all of the people who are raging when they are replying to your ads, right? So those are all use cases where we blend different data sources and make sure that we ship them to different destinations in order to activate them. Activating also means deactivating them to some extent, right? Negative audiences. It's all built around data activation. Now, if we look into the anatomy of a customer data warehouse built for data activation, you kind of end up with this big setup. On the left-hand side, you kind of have all of the sources, where previously they were advertising channels and all those type of things. Today, what we're looking into more is like applications. What data is being generated in my iOS app, in my Android app? What data is being generated by users in my website? What data is being used in or generated into customer support centers? What data is being used in offline data points of sales, right? We all gather that data. I'm not going into the behavioral data layer of how we capture that. I think that's a topic separately entirely. There's also the whole notion of consent that you need to take into account, so we're not skipping it, we're just diving into it. We gather that data and we put it again in the landing zone, right? It's quite similar to what we do with a marketing data warehouse. Now, the tricky part is if we're starting to collect data from different sources, it also means that we usually have different identifiers. My name is Glenn van der Linde. I have an ID card number. I have an email address. I have an iPhone, which has a device ID, a push token ID. I have a Mac, where I have 2 browsers. Each of them would have anonymous ID, so you kind of get the point, right? For more complex use cases, you'll probably need a unification engine. Data then travels through, gets, again, dumped in structured environments or tables, and then we start building activation layers. We call it reverse ETL. It's basically the reverse thing of extract, transform, and load, right? We take it from the warehouse and we ship it to a destination. And usually what we need is an audience builder on top of that. What is an audience builder? It's kind of a point-and-clicky thing that replaces SQL with natural language. I would like to select all of the users who have completed a purchase in the last 30 days and who have an open ticket with support in order to push them to an email flow to get stuff done. That's kind of what the audience builder does. It's built for marketing people, so you don't need the whole engineering setup or the SQL skills in order to get there. Now, the next question kind of would be, does this sound familiar? Who of you in the room is familiar with customer data platforms? Cool. Then you might be familiar with the whole concept of composable data platforms. If you're not, there's a guide that a couple of weeks we released with a guy called Arpit from DataBeats that you might be interested in, and it kind of shows which components a customer data platform actually consists of. And there's always the choice, am I going to buy a CDP or am I going to build a CDP, right? The discussion on buying, on building is a topic entirely separate. But the most important thing, what you need to know is like when you buy a packaged CDP, you go to a vendor and that vendor kind of makes sure that the whole chain that you've seen behind me is actually bought in one point solution. If you're going to compose your own CDP, you're actually going to look either for open source software or proprietary vendor software, and you're going to build it yourself. It's kind of the hacky, engineering, geeky way of doing it, and it comes with upsides and it comes with downsides, like everything. Now, I mentioned that we would zoom in 2 crucial components, unification and reverse ETL. There's one remark to be made around unification. There's a lot of use cases. I mentioned Facebook CAPI. You don't need unification to go to Facebook CAPI, right? If you have an email address and you don't need to match it, and you have transactional data, and you have all of the points or data points in one payload, you can just stream it through. But if you need to blend different data sources for more advanced use cases, unification is going to be a big challenge. Now, what is the concept of unification? It's basically building an identity cluster or identity graph for a specific user. Like I mentioned, I'm Glenn. I have a first name, a last name. I have an email address. I actually have 2. I have multiple mobile devices, multiple browsers. So all of these identifiers need to find their way into one cluster to figure out, like, who am I? if I connect with this device, but I'm not logged in, are you able to sync my behavioral data with the data I have later on as a transaction? All those type of things. Kind of went through this. These are some popular anonymous IDs we usually work with. There's anonymous ID, user IDs, email addresses. We see a lot of device IDs because they're kind of more stable than some other IDs. Push tokens, phone numbers, not a huge fan, by the way, because it's a free field thingy normally, which means it messes up quite a bit. And that brings us to the main challenge when you build identity resolution or unification, which is, I think, the challenge that most people here are dealing with, which is data quality, right? Data quality is a massive challenge in general, but it's definitely a challenge when you try to do identity resolution, because basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to bind all of these identities and bring them back to a single person to get a customer 360-degree overview, which is what everybody wants these days, right? Super tricky. What we've seen is that when you have single sign-on, it works fairly well. We have a couple of clients that we're lucky with who have single sign-on, basically meaning that we have one identity to rule them all, if you will. And based on that, we can actually use that as the #1 identifier with a cardinality of 1 throughout time in order to bundle all of these identities underneath. And so we're able to match behavioral data from applications, from website behavior with transactional data in the backend, with tickets that they log in the platforms, with even in some cases for some venues where they batch their tickets, we know they're there, right? Because it's all under the hood of one single sign-on ID. Avoid fuzzy matching. It's just something I'm going to mention really quick. Fuzzy matching basically means that you're going to use probability in order to figure out or guesstimate if a user is the user you think he or she is. Which I don't need to tell you, in a world where privacy is a big thing these days, you don't want to blend my data with yours and then send it to the wrong person, right? You don't want that stuff to happen. Very interesting point as well. If you're going to start building your own identity resolution engine, what you need to look into is merge policies or profile merge policies. I'll come back to that later. But it's kind of the idea, what happens or what do you do when there's a conflict? What happens if I use my computer, my colleague uses the same computer, we have the same anonymous ID, and then we each sign in our own user identity? Like, how does that work? What are we going to do with that? So we've been working on this because we don't always have clients who buy CDPs. Some want to have a composed CDP. And so people way smarter than me, by the way, in the company are trying to solve this, for the record. But what we're usually starting with is simple joins, right? I have two tables or I have a couple of data sets. I'm going to join them on a specific ID. At that point, we decide that that ID is the #1 tier ID with a specific cardinality. In most cases, it's going to be user ID. The tricky thing is, the more complex, the more identifiers you get, the more complex it becomes, because you need to do more joins. If you're a bit familiar with SQL, you know it's not the most fun thing to do or not always as easy to do at scale. But the good thing is here, the go-to-market time or the speed to market is fairly quick. Even if we sometimes need more robust or elaborate identification or identity resolution engines, we would still start with a join. For the simple reason that if we need to merge 2 or 3 data sets, the speed to market is simply faster to start with a join, while in the back, we're working on something more elaborate. And lately, we've been experimenting with something called graphs. Graphs basically means that I am Glenn, I have anonymous ID 123, I sign in, all of a sudden I become user ID ABC. A and B are 2 nodes. Between the 2 nodes, there's an edge. If on the second identity, that identity is seen with an email address, glenn@human37.com, there's another edge. And because A equals B and B equals C, well, we basically have an identity cluster of 3 identities. The thing is, when you parse through your data that way, you could rack up quite some volume. It's quite resource intensive. Alejandro talked about the cost of things. So from the volume of, let's say, 20 million seen identities, and it's kind of an arbitrary number that our teams use to, or use as a reminder to do like, okay, we should go back and see where we can incrementally optimize our queries and our workloads in order to make sure that we don't overuse resources. But that's typically the point where you see your first milestone and check like, okay, we should go back and check if we can like streamline the whole session. And then last but not least, mitigation strategies for over-merging. Like when you go through graphs, you basically keep racking up identities, right? And this is an actual screenshot of an identity resolution solution that we've built for a client. And on the left-hand side, you see an identity cluster. I don't know how many identities there are there, but it's a lot, right? And what you see is that they're all being merged by this thing called SSO ID 0. Which means that this SSO ID 0 is the node that connects all of the other identities together, and we get this huge identity. This is a problem, because actually what's in there, there's a bunch of people in there. And what we figured out was that SSO ID was being used by all of the technical teams, all of the internal teams, as a testing ID, which means that we kept racking up all of these identities. So we need mitigation policies in order to get this, or to avoid this in general. After removing SSO ID, you kind of get clusters that are more this type, which consists of kind of 9 nodes, which means that there's 9 identities for this specific user, and that user consists, or those 9 identities create the user identity cluster for that person. If a user would connect with any of these 9 identities, would be able to unify the data and actually add the data points that they're generating to their general record that gives us an overview of what that user is doing or how that user is interacting with us as a brand. Now, I probably give everybody a headache with, like, are you going to build it? Trust me, the teams who are building this are having fun. It doesn't sound like it, but they do. There's always the alternative, right? If I don't want to build it, can I buy it? You can. There are CDP vendors out there, to give you a couple of names, Segment and Particle, who actually offer identity resolution engines. They're part of a customer data platform suite or a package CDP, but more and more what you actually see is in a world of composable SaaS, if you want to say it like that, there's identity resolutions that are starting to emerge that are built right on top of the data warehouse. Examples are Zing or Truity, which basically allow you to resolve identities with whatever data you have in the warehouse as a standalone solution. Now, last but not least, reverse ETL. Big question is, for some of you maybe, why do we need reverse ETL? Because otherwise we will be stuck again in a reporting layer, right? It's fun to have that customer 360-degree view, which is, by the way, the user story or the requirements we get for all RFPs these days. But it's actually only a means to an end, right? You want the customer 360-degree view in order to do something with some of the data of that user. And that's why you need reverse ETL, because a customer data warehouse is built around customer data activation, not only reporting. So you wake up one morning and you feel kind of brave and you want to build this stuff yourself. It's actually easier than identity resolution, from what I've been told. But there's a bunch of flags you need to take into account. Like you need to manage the mapping of the fields, you need to manage the APIs, the updates. What happens if you hit quotas or if your data doesn't get delivered? Do you build your own retry system, yes or no? Again, you're almost in product development, right? This kind of works if you have an elaborate team of IT people who enjoy building, which is absolutely fine, or if you have budgets to partner with somebody who's willing to do that for you. That all makes sense. You'll typically need kind of 2 components, a connector, something to run code in, and then persistent storage to validate against and to basically read all of your logs and figure out what's going on. The tricky thing is here you don't have an audience builder. So you're going to build a connection once. You'll need to maintain it, and most likely, if you do it well, I guarantee you, you're going to get requests to build more connectors, so congratulations, all of a sudden you're a SaaS company. But basically, you don't have an audience builder, which means that all of the things are going to be change requests on your product that you're building. The independence of marketing is very low here, but still feasible. Now, instead of building it, can you buy it? These days, you can kind of buy everything, I feel, but yes, you can. There are solutions which are specifically positioning on reverse ETL. Give a name, a couple are high-touch, Census, Wealth, there's probably a couple of more. But it allows you to grab the data from the data warehouse, build a model, and open up that model to an audience builder. What does that mean? That a marketer can say, like, okay, I have all of the data from this source, and this source, and I actually want to build these audiences using dropdowns, stuff that you know from DoubleClick or from Google Ads or from Facebook. A visual audience builder. So non-technical people can actually replace SQL by dropdowns, right? The interesting part is that these products are evolving. They come with audience builders, but they also often come with personalization APIs. It's something that we didn't really touch upon yet, but if you want to personalize on the website, well, it's fairly tricky to do with a data warehouse because how are you going to do it without building your own API layer on top of the data warehouse? So these guys come with personalization APIs, which means that if there's data available in the data warehouse, I probably could use it once a user signs in to personalize the website based on what the user's profile looks like. When do I build and when do I buy, which is probably the next question? Well, there's no straight answer. I'm very sorry, there's a consulting answer, which usually is like, it depends. And it actually does depend. It depends on how fast you want to go to market, how complex are your use cases, which resources do you have available in-house versus in partners, and how are you staffing, right? There's a lot of debate on packaged CDPs versus composable CDPs. And everybody, or there's a large debate going on that, and a lot of people make it appear like they're exactly the same thing. They're not. Like you've seen, like building this stuff is like hardcore. It's hard work, and it makes sense if you're that type of business. If you want to own the connectors, if you want to build stuff, and if you're a building company, all of that stuff makes sense. There's a follow-up article that we wrote to kind of help people make decision-making on buy versus build, and kind of help them orient. Now, I've talked about composable CDPs. The question is like, okay, what are some of the use cases that we put in production, right? One of our clients is a football club. And what they do is they're a very big football club. And basically what happens is all the tickets are usually sold out. That being said, it's not because a ticket is sold out that people are actually attending, right? Maybe you're sick, maybe you can't come, you just have a ticket and you need to get rid of it. They own kind of a peer-to-peer reselling platform. Which allows people who can't attend the game to open up their tickets for other people. Now, if you do the math of events in general, it's not only about the ticket sales, it's also about the people attending, because the customer lifetime value of an attending customer is actually way higher than a customer who doesn't attend but has a ticket, right? I don't have to explain you the math on that. So one of the user stories that we worked on was, as a marketeer, I would like to be able to let people who are most likely to be interested in the tickets but didn't get them while the event is already sold out, to let them know that a ticket is available. And so what we're actually doing is we're using transactional data from the data warehouse, but in the data warehouse we also have behavioral data, if available, if the client consented. We're able to actually have an idea of what the propensity to transact is for a specific customer, right? If an event is sold out or a game is sold out, what we basically can do is we build an audience saying that show me all the people who have a higher likelihood to attend the game but were not able to, and then we move that data into our own activation channels. Meaning in this case it would be ESPs, I think we use Iterable for that, email service provider, and we have push notifications that we're able to ship out through Airship. Which means that as soon as tickets enter the secondary market, we're able to just activate those audiences immediately in an owned environment and not necessarily in a paid environment. Second use case is increasing the relevancy of a product offering. This is actually a very cool use case. The other one too, by the way, but this is actually a very elaborate use case. One of our clients is a flash sale website. What they do is they have sales up and running for 20 to 48 hours, depending on the inventory they have. And they sell about 10 product categories, right? What they saw last quarter, or sorry, Q4 of last year, is that they tried to ramp up the number of products per category. The interesting thing is, well, for business it was good, revenue went up. On the other hand, clients were less satisfied because they were kind of getting lost in the whole like, but yeah, okay, I come here for 10 products a day, and now all of a sudden I find 20 or 30, and it's not what I signed up for. So customer satisfaction kind of was under pressure. So what we figured is like, okay, but how can we personalize at scale depending on different categories? What we did is we built audiences, and one of the test audiences we're actually running is people who don't consume alcohol, because 3 categories out of 10 are actually alcoholic products. And if we know that a customer does not consume alcohol, and you're going to ask me how do we know that, obviously it's an assumption, because on average we have all of the data since, I believe, 2009 or something. On average, we can calculate how long it takes for somebody who is actually an alcohol product buyer to do their first purchase. If they don't do that first purchase, we flag them as somebody not in that audience or not interested. And based on that, we basically start personalizing, one, their communication by not showing it to them, and by actually personalizing the website. As soon as somebody logs in, we're able to hide specific product categories, which means that we can keep the number of SKUs to drive the revenue, but we work on specific audiences and their specific criteria to decrease dissatisfaction and product overload. So those are 2 use cases, and we push that, by the way, in paid channels and owned channels, because those are audiences we just ship from the data warehouse to paid channels, Meta, Google Ads, all of that stuff. And we use it in owned channels for ESP and push notifications. Now, what do I want you to remember from this talk I still hope it's an exciting journey, by the way, guys. It is. That not all data warehouses are created equal. There's a difference between marketing data warehouses, which is for reporting and mostly PII agnostic. And there's customer data warehousing, which is built for data activation. A full customer data activation infrastructure or customer data warehouse infrastructure actually has components of a composable CDP. Most important, the reverse ETL layer, unification layer for more elaborate use cases. And both can be built or bought, depending on what kind of person or company you are. Most important takeaway for me is still that the data is only valuable to you as a business as long as it generates value for the customer, right? It's all about customer data activation. That's also kind of why we started this company, to focus on activating the data and not simply just collecting or reporting on it. That's it on my end. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, please shoot.
Before the question, do we have a question right off the bat? Yeah, over there. Thank you for summarizing the problems we face. The data is a lot of fun, the user interface not so much if you have to do it yourself. So great. Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, Glenn, for the presentation. It was very interesting. Thank you very much. I have a question regarding the reverse ETL. How do you solve or go about sending PII to the vendors like Meta or something, like email addresses, or how do you manage to create audiences that are usable in the platforms, so to speak?
Yeah, I think there's two levels of that. First, we only can send PII once we have consent. Obviously, that's the one thing. And when you actually build it yourself, you have to encrypt it yourself, which is a joy. When you buy a solution, what's interesting is that a lot of these solutions, they don't store data. So basically, they are if you will, a view or a window on top of your data warehouse where you can say, like, okay, I want to select this piece, and this piece. And before you send it off, they basically take care of the encryption for you. So they have built-in encryption mechanisms that encrypt it before sending. It also means that they encrypt it on the fly. They don't store anything, which is actually the thing you want if you're moving PII, right? So that's kind of how we go about. Then there's the whole discussion of, like, it's not because I transacted or I am a customer and I did a transaction that you are allowed, or how do I rephrase this? This is going to be a legal thing. Boo. That it's not because I can ship it that I should ship it, right? And that's usually a conversation that we have with the DPO, saying that, okay, we have a customer, are we allowed to share the data, even though it's encrypted or not, yes or no? Because a lot of DPOs, and it's very interesting, in Belgium, they have kind of the shift between DPOs putting themselves in the shoes of the customer. Is this what I'm expecting as a customer? Even though you're allowed to, or not allowed to, depends kind of, am I expecting it as a customer? And using that vantage point, and even if the legal framework might be there, a lot of them say, no, we don't do it, which is kind of interesting, and it's kind of the purpose as well of what we're trying to do. I hope that kind of answers your question. Go ahead.
So what you're saying is it's like a conscious decision that the company has to make. Would you recommend building a complete customer activation platform when you decide not to do the reverse ETL because of privacy concerns? Or so is it useful then just for reporting purposes, or?
But the thing is, I come from a non-engineering background, right? So I'll always try to find the shortest way to get stuff done. My preference, very personal, there's other people in the company, and lucky I have them to counterbalance that whole idea and actually find a solution for the customer, because would be to go reverse ETL for the simple reason that they're relatively cheap, between brackets, and they scale with the use cases that you do, right? If you only have one or two use cases, you could still build it. But that also means you need to maintain it. You need to make sure that Michael, who built it, documents well, very important. It doesn't leave the company and leaves you with bits and pieces to figure out how the stuff works, right? It's kind of outsourced when you do this type of stuff. We have a use case where we purely reverse ETL abandoned basket. Don't go into the details of why we need to do it that way, but we have limitations that require us to do it through a data warehouse. And we just do below 100x on an annual revenue versus the cost of having that license. So if you ask me, like the go-to-market speed is like you sign up, you pass your credit cards, you give access to the data warehouse, build the model, and you start shipping. But again, it's very me. So.